When looking at financial strategy, retailers often use the strategic profit model to help analyze their financial strength. In this lecture, I'm going to walk you through the strategic profit model so that you can understand how retailers assess the financial strength of their businesses. The strategic profit model is a method for summarizing all of the factors that affect a firm's financial performance. And the appropriate measure for success for retailers is not necessarily profit, but it's return on assets, which we introduced in the first lecture of this chapter. Return on assets measures profits that a firm makes relative to the assets that it possesses. And the goal for the retailer is to have a very high ROA because it means that the retailer is generating more sales dollars for each dollar that they invest into their assets. So the strategic profit model is ultimately going to help us get to this ROA measurement. And the strategic profit model is going to separate the ROA into two components, showing that it's based on two sets of activities. So the strategic profit model combines our operating profit margin with our asset turnover. So retailers will generally focus on one of these measurement paths in order to work towards achieving a higher ROA. So some retailers focus on the profit management path, which you see on the top half of the model there. And using the profit management path to get to the operating profit margin measures the profitability that a firm makes from continuing operations. Some retailers, on the other hand, will focus on the asset management path and attempt to have a very high asset turnover. Asset turnover assesses the productivity of a firm's investments in their assets. So both of these paths are part of the strategic profit model as we work towards ROA. And ROA is determined by multiplying the operating profit margin by asset turnover. So what we're going to do today in this lecture is walk through an example of activities that fall within each path, and we'll discuss how ROA can be achieved through a various combination of the activities within these two paths. So we're going to start with the profit management path. All of the information that you need to analyze the profit margin management path can be found on a firm's income statement. So an income statement summarizes the financial performance of a firm over a period of time. And in the case that we're going to be looking at, measures and summarizes financial performance within a year. Right? So there are four components to the profit margin path that we're going to be looking at, and it's going to use all of these components from the income statement. So it's first going to look at net sales and other income. So net sales are sales related to selling merchandise. Revenue is all sources of income. So the difference here, if you think of a wholesale club like Costco or Sam's Club, they're going to have a net sales, which is going to show all of the profit that they make, or all of the income that they make, all of the income that they make from selling merchandise. And then their revenue might include both their sales and it might include their membership fee. So we have net sales, we have revenue, we have cost of goods sold, which is the amount of money that the retailer pays their vendor for the products they're buying. And then finally, we have gross margin. Gross margin shows the retailer how much profit they are making on their revenues. And this doesn't yet consider operating expenses and overhead expenses. It's just looking at revenue. So operating profit margin is the last component of the income statement, and operating profit margin is going to show us all of our fundamental operations and how those impact our profitability. So you have an income statement in front of you for Costco and Macy's, and if you haven't printed that yet, pause the lecture now, go back to the Chapter 6 content and print out the income statement and balance sheet because you will need them to work through a few problems in this lecture. And let's look at some of the key equations on the profit management path. So the first component that we're going to look at, the first ratio that we need, is our gross margin percentage. And the way that we calculate gross margin percentage is we take our gross margin and we divide that by our net sales. We use gross margin percentage to compare the performance of various types of merchandise categories within our store. It can also be used to compare the performance of our gross margin compared to other gross margins. So let's calculate Costco and Macy's. As you can see, if you look at the gross margin category, Costco's has more than triple Macy's sales, right? If we look at the net sales in the top left, we see that Costco had over $97,000 in sales and Macy's had just over $26,000 in sales. But if you look at gross margin, the gross margin percentage there, Macy's is actually higher. And margins are generally higher at department stores because people are willing to pay higher prices for their merchandise. If you think about what's sold at Macy's versus Costco, Costco sells in bulk and they sell items like peanut butter and toilet paper and Diet Coke. And so those items, consumers could go to lots of competitors and buy the same product. And so they have to keep their prices relatively low. Macy's, on the other hand, sells apparel, accessories, and shoes that sometimes are very unique to that retail store. So they're able to charge a higher price and therefore make a larger margin. Okay. So SG&A as a percentage of sales is the next equation that we're going to look at. And these are our selling and general and administrative expenses. And so when we look at that, we take our operating expenses and we divide it by our net sales. And what this is going to show us is how well we are using our SG&A expenses in an effort to make money. And so what you'll see when you do the calculations for both Costco and Macy's is that Costco does have significantly less operating expenses than Macy's does. And that's reasonable because Costco has less customer service, they locate in lower rent areas, and they sell in bulk. So their sales associates aren't spending time unpacking product and shelving it individually. So the last equation, and arguably the most important here, is the operating profit margin percentage. Operating profit margin percentage basically is going to combine the gross margin percentage and the SG&A. And so we're going to look at our gross margin, we're going to subtract out our operating expenses and divide that by our net sales. And again, all of those numbers can be found on the income statement. So when you calculate Costco and Macy's, what you see is that Macy's operating profit margin percentage is almost 3 times greater than Costco. So here's the numbers. And you can see if you look down at the bottom 3 lines, Costco's gross margin percent is 12.7, whereas Macy's was 40.4. For SG&A, Costco's was 9.8 and Macy's was 31.4. And for operating profit percentage, Costco's was 2.9 and Macy's was 9%. So if I am only using the profit margin path of the strategic profit model, I would think that Macy's is performing at a much higher level than Costco in terms of performance, and so they are the more successful retailer. So there's a reason why we have to use 2 paths when we're looking at the strategic profit model. We need to give Costco a chance to compete with Macy's here. So if you're an investor and you're trying to determine where to put your money, if you're looking just at the profit margin percentage path, you would think that Macy's is the way to go. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the asset management path and we'll see why perhaps Costco is just as successful as Macy's.